Hello and welcome to Burgundy Unpicked podcast series with Courtney and Barry. This is our second episode, coming hot off the heels of Lefebvre 2023 Focus podcast with myself, Guy and Bryce. I'm Joe Muller, and I'm joined. There's a four ball in the room today. We've got Guy is back with us. Hello, Guy.
Hello. Hi, Joe.
We've got Mr. Aaron Eccles here.
Hey. Hello.
And Neville Kirkpatrick's joining as well.
Hello.
So we are one of the core members of the crack teams, plural, who went out to Burgundy to taste the 2023 vintage. Guy being the common denominator amongst all of them, as is always the way. But yeah, we spent 3 weeks across October and November, individually and with some other members and colleagues from Scotland and the north of England. And we spent a good amount of time visiting our producers, as you know, to taste the wines, get an idea of the vintage, and see what we can bring back to you guys with in terms of info. But this episode is solely focused on a vintage report. So we want to know 2023, what's the style? How did we find it? Did we like it? What can we sort of get across to you guys, the drinkers, to get a bit of an idea before you come along, hopefully, to our wonderful tasting in January and experience the pleasure of 23, because it's a very much a pleasure-giving vintage for yourselves. So, Guy, do you want to start us off on the vintage and the sort of the character of it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joe. So in terms of the vintage and our expectations when we went out to Burgundy, I think we had in our minds that there may be some similar factors to 2022, and we were expecting a set of wines that maybe looked a little bit similar to the 22s. So that was my starting point in the back of my mind. And we quite quickly realized that that wasn't the case, and that whereas 22 had been a sort of universally easy, successful growing season and vintage where the wines were sort of almost effortlessly lovely, 23 had quite a few more challenges and spanners thrown into the works along the way. And the route for me to sort of understanding the vintage was to begin to understand what those factors were and how people had dealt with them. So, I mean, just to take three things without I don't really want to go through month by month because, I mean, you can read into the detail of that. But to look at sort of three factors, the first in 23 was that it was potentially a huge crop and that you really had to do a lot of work in order to thin out the potential yields that you were getting in order to produce high quality wines. This was done at various stages throughout the season. First of all, by debudding, which is done around the time of flowering, or just before flowering, rather. Then by green harvesting, which is done when the bunches are still green and still, at the grape phase, but before they mature fully. There was an interesting one this year, which people were talking about, called blue harvest, which is at around the time of veraison, when some of the bunches have turned blue or turned red, turned black. The others, which have remained green, are deselected and are cut off. And that's a third way of thinning the crop. So first of all, people had to do all of that work in the vineyards.
Do you know, I love it when new terms come out, don't you? It's there's always those little phrases and coins. That's being, débonage was the thing from 22, wasn't it, or 21, and constantly repeated. So you've got to have one thrown in the mix. So
absolutely,
blue harvest, lovely.
And then the second of the factors that I was going to mention as the sort of hot lead into harvest. So there was a real boom in temperatures right at the end of August and beginning of September. And they were harvesting in what I think Jean-Luc Petelier at de Vogüé called a crazy hot interlude. They were harvesting in this 2-week lead-in to picking amid temperatures which looked more like July than September. And so that really required managing. Somebody said to us that they increased the potential alcohol level by 1.5% over the space of 3 or 4 days, which is obviously a very rapid increase in ripeness. And so, you really had to be on your toes in terms of picking at the right time. The third factor was the rain. It then rained in the second week of September, and there was a split between the growers, between those who had picked before the rain started and those who waited until the rain had passed through and finished harvesting after. And depending on what the state of the vineyard was at that point in time, some people said they were grateful that they'd picked before the rain. Some people said it actually brought a welcome freshness to the grapes. So I think it depends on where your vineyard was really at that at that point of the season. The only other points I would make in terms of profile of the wines, this was all just by way of saying that 23 is really quite different from 22 and was a far more challenging season. The other thing that I would sort of draw out of the wines that we tasted is that there's a lot of freshness. Even though it's a relatively high pH vintage, the wines taste very fresh, and the alcohols are nice and low. They're sort of 13.5% at most after blending, which is a nice place to be. So that, from me, is a sort of very short look through the factors behind the season.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. I mean, to come back on the sort of three things with a few other sort of tidbits and sort of info rolling around my head, the various stages to begin with of debudding, and is almost to sort of obviously control the yields. And this is an important point. Some people, majority of people did make more wine. There are some cases and instances where actually some people made less than 22 by decisions they decided within the vineyard that you've mentioned to help measure those controls. I know that Alessandro Noli was telling us that, for example, a lot of people had applied to make more than 45 hectolitres per hectare. 35 hectares per hectare, the permitted maximum yield for Grand Cru, just in case they were going to do it. Now, they didn't actually, in many of those circumstances, decide to go for that sort of cropping at the end of it. But it's just to give you an idea that, the excitement was there, the people were happy about the way things were developing. It looked like the abundance was there. But there was probably in early stages a little bit of concern, was that going to sacrifice quality? And the beautiful thing is it really, really hasn't, because coming back to what you were saying about the harvest time, that 2-week sort of heat wave that came in the beginning of sort of mid to late August, particularly before whites were beginning to be harvested, was very, very crucial, because it allowed that phenolic ripeness to get to the point where it caught up in a real sort of harmony, where you've got sort of malic ripeness sort of decreasing, and they had to be quick. You mentioned that. They also had to start early when the temperatures were nice and cool in the morning, stopping a lot of the time by 2 p.m. as we understand it. But I think as well it plays into the management side of the estates really had to be tested, because if you had quite a lot of holdings and you've got this sort of, this big window of warmth, accelerating maturity of the grapes on the vines, you've got to plan exactly right. We've got this window where we want to nail down our Premier Cru vineyards. And it might be a slight sacrifice of, let's say, Bourgogne level or Village level, because they've had to put that towards the back of the pecking order in terms of this quick window to get everything in. But generally speaking, most people managed it. But it does mean that outside of the bigger states, you've probably got some absolute overachievers at that sort of Village level and Premier Cru level, because they haven't had as bigger holdings. They've been able to focus the time. So it's a real vintage where you need to speak to the merchant. You really need that advice, which is why we're here. We want to sort of help get the message across. The tasting is going to be there, so we can bore you to death on everything there from the weeks of tasting and talking with the domain owners. And the very final part, which you mentioned on the rain, there's little really fun pieces of information. Nadine Kublan, I remember, was telling us when we tasted Jacques Prieur that the Côte de Nuit had this rainfall in July, where the Côte de Beaune didn't, and that actually resulted in lower alcohols by 1 degree almost within Domaine Jacques Prieur's holding itself. So that would have been mirrored elsewhere. But yeah, I think it's a vintage where you really need to sort of gain amongst the weeds, so to speak, and taste and experience it.
Yeah, I think definitely. But I think one of the things that struck me when Guy and I were tasting out there was I was sort of chatting to lots of growers, because I mean, obviously there's all of these kind of factors at play about how you manage the big crop of 2023 and how how to manage some of the warmer weather towards the end of August. But I asked a couple of growers, what was one of the kind of defining events of the season that kind of pulled it all together. So we always, I think, focus on the challenges, but was there something that happened that really worked in your favour that kind of shaped the vintage? And two or three people spoke to me about that they had this very, very welcome rain in early August, in the first 10 days of August in both the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune. And I think what, several people spoke about was that this was the thing that really switch the profile from 22 to a very unique feel of 23. Because in 2022 they had this sort of glorious but very warm August, and it did result in a couple of growers experiencing a little bit of blockage, which basically means that the vines shut down a little during the growing season and stop maturing. But because they had this sort of refreshing burst of rain at the beginning of August, the vineyards, retained lots of freshness. There was no blockage, and the kind of maturity continued in a sort of more sort of even way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Nev. And the fact that they had blockage of maturity in 22, when photosynthesis temporarily stopped, actually resulted not only in lower alcohols, because the photosynthesis, the ripening process didn't continue, but the acidity didn't continue to drop in the same way. So paradoxically, you get a retention of freshness due to a blockage of maturity. And, the freshness in 22 is in part due to that, whereas the freshness in 23 is a sort of more straightforward sense of freshness due to the fact that the soils were nice and moist.
Yeah, firstly, that word frost we haven't had to mention once, which is just fantastic. But after so many vintages that we sort of discuss frost, it's a nice thing that we are talking about higher yields. This is exactly the sort of season that growers do actually want. No frost, lots of rain early on in the season that replenishes water tables. It just means that then vignerons can show their mettle. They can choose exactly what bunches they want to remain on the vine. They know what looks high quality, and they can keep those. And the second part that we always discuss now a little bit more, as well as frost, is heat. And particularly in vintages like 2018, 2019, 20 and 22, we talk about sort of heat and blockages, so much so that when you talk to some producers about a vintage like 2018, even the ferments struggled because of the heat, meaning that the sort of nitrogen was so depleted that it struggled with the ferments. There's none of that this year. The 2023 ferments, from start to finish, all seem sort of quite happy. There's no need for anyone to make what one producer once described to me as Coca-Cola wine. No need for any adjustments this year.
Yeah, well, I think that sort of goes over the growing season quite nicely, and vintage as a starting point. So we've mentioned obviously that key word has been probably freshness. That's been repeated by everyone, and it really is. It's a brilliant attribute to the wines of 23, because I went out there aware of this sort of sunny period. We saw it on Instagram, we saw it from producers, and you're instantly thinking, right, l'année solaire, this is going to be another sort of fruit bomb. It's going to be rich. It's going to be alcohols. We've discussed all of that. And the one thing you sort of don't always expect maybe the wines to have was this sort of kick of beautifully lifted freshness that just gave a buoyancy to the palate. So I think let's talk about styles now. In terms of whites and reds, for me, it's about that sort of texture, and obviously having pHs in the wine is going to sort of contribute to that quite nicely in the way it plays with the acid profile, and the fruit ripeness can accentuate that. And malolactics we haven't touched on too much yet, but generally they were over quite quickly. So there are some wines, and I'll be brutally honest, that's why we're here. There is a range of textures on the whites. Some of them are quite lactic. The majority aren't. So I was expecting probably to be the former, more the situation within 23. And I like that because, I definitely want some creaminess. I definitely want some sort of silky sort of traits of textural gain within my white Burgundy. And depending on the terroir, I maybe want it to be a slightly lesser role to pronounce more austere mineral-driven styles. But when you've got the right vineyard and the right components, texture is obviously a crucial part. So I think, again, coming back to what we say, you need to sort of taste around and get an idea of with the merchants you speak to of which wines and how they've played it out. And on the reds, before I move on, for me, a big thing was probably the tannin the textures of the tannin again, because tannin was there and it was within the skins, and we're going to have different components again. If you picked post rain, pre rain, there's going to be different profiles with just purely before you're pressing the wines from the way the skins are structured. Stems were ripe as well, so you've got whole bunch character in more prominent play, which I'll let someone touch upon in more detail. But the tannin texture was lovely, and it was really varied because you had sort of chalky, you had very fine sweet grained, you had more powdery tannins, but on the whole, I would say they've been really well managed in 23, and I think that's a gift of that heat wave, because I think you probably had to do something quite poor in the in the winery in order to mess that up. So texture for me is one of those things that is here. Nev?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was struck immediately by the charm of both the reds and the whites. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that there is a variation of styles in I think particularly the whites. Actually, I think the whites hit real highs in places, but I think so there is a little bit of variation. But I think what's interesting about the whites is that in the places where you did get a little bit more of a sort of hedonistic style, a little bit more richness, a little bit more of the kind of yellow fruit rather than green, there is still quite a nice kind of acid backbone to support all that. So I think, we're really lucky that, we've got a real spectrum of customers that love a real spectrum of styles. And I think what's nice is that if you do like your white Burgundy a little bit more on the richer side, like you absolutely have that in places. But I still think there is a nice kind of spine of acid that runs through all of those, which I think is, one of the hallmarks of great white Burgundy. Conversely, if you are sort of into what I would probably describe as a slightly more modern style these days, which is white Burgundy is a real sort of energy and verve and sort of on the sort of more green fruited side of the spectrum, then we're very blessed to have numerous producers that are delivering those too. So I mean, there's a I think what's nice, there's a little bit of something for everyone this year.
I was just thinking in terms of vintage comparisons, it's always tricky and it's always a dangerous game to play to compare the new vintage to something which we know much better. But I think 2017 probably needs mentioning in the sense that, it was more fresh than it was fruity. It was a vintage where you don't have sort of tons of concentration and it's not an upfront powerful vintage, but there's a lovely texture to it. There's a lovely precision and poise to it. And I think obviously a very high quality white wine vintage. The whites stood out more in 2017 than the reds did. And I think that's not the case in 23. I would say that it's almost the other way around in 23. But the quality potential of the white 23s, I think, is very high. As Nev touched upon, I think there is a variation within that. But I think at their best, they can be very, very good. And Jean Orsoni at Puy de l'Ors, one of our newest additions to the CMB portfolio, commented that he thought there was a comparison with the reds of 2019, which showed themselves to be unexpectedly good, and the whites of 23, which he thinks will surprise people as time goes on. He actually said he thought it was the vintage potentially of the decade for white wines. So there you go. You have the whole spectrum of views.
Bold statement. I'm going to come on to Aaron's opinion on the vintage as well. I'm going to give my little 2 pennies because I think that's what I said to you guys. And admittedly, Guy's probably got the best picture because he's been out for the tasted in most breadth and was the longest time in Burgundy doing so. But the reds, I find there's a cross between 19 and 18. And what I mean by that is that fruit forward style that 19 had, and you've got that charm and you've got that florality in cases where the terroir gives more ethereal styles. But you've also got that sort of slightly denser character as well than what 19 showed in that early stage. And with 18 reds, that was very much there. There was a danger, which I mean in a loving way, because 18 did have this and it will shed it. But 18, I remember always, it sort of wore the vintage stamp across the wines more than the terroir, which will shed in time. And I think 18 reds are glorious. And I was wondering, was 23 going to be the same? And it doesn't necessarily have that. There are in some cases a little bit more about that sort of impact of whether it be the rainfall, but predominantly the heat wave that we've spoken about. But on most, I would say actually no. The reflection of the vineyard and the typicity really wins out. On the whites, it's almost similar again, but for me, it was a mix of 19 and 17. So again, you've got that sort of fruit forward, almost virality side coming through on the whites, but there's an energy within the wines in the best cases, which we'll move on to shortly in some examples. There was electricity running through the Chardonnays. Yeah, what would you say? Concur or?
It was such an enjoyable vintage to taste, and in what's increasingly become a very sort of opinionated and binary world of everything's the best or the worst. It was very enjoyably somewhere in the middle. It wasn't like tasting. It wasn't like tasting the whites of 2014, where you came back and you felt that the enamel had been stripped from your palate. It wasn't like tasting the reds of 2018, where you felt that these were big, rich wines that needed a lot of time. The whites, there is, I have a list already of, if you like creamy, richer whites, these are the wines that you should go for. And if sort of more towards the style that I am unapologetically in love with, which is that sort of absolute lemon rocket, then there are those styles as well, which are fantastic. And then on the reds, the winemaking is of a different level. They are red fruited. When they're on limestone soils, you feel that chalky tension that comes through. The winemaking of infusion that we talk about, which has become that big watchword, has now really fully taken over. Of less pigeage, no more punch downs, no real heavy working of the ferments. Let the perfume, let the texture come through, and make sure that the winemaker is there as a guiding hand rather than putting a stamp on it, and a vintage stamp as well. It's great to taste.
Yeah, lovely.
There was one producer, I was just remembering what you were saying about that sort of veneer of fruit that can occur in sort of vintages like 18 or maybe 22. And it was interesting to taste at Wondermen the 3 Grand Crus, so Chambertin, Latricia, and Chapelle. And then immediately after, taste the 22s that they happened to have open from a tasting the previous day. And the 23s were far more expressive. They were showing the terroir characteristics. And the 22s, you could see they were going to be stunning, good wines, but they were quite hidden. They were quite sort of under a veil at that point.
Yeah, I think that we're getting to ultimately, I think, the crux of it and the reds between 22 and 23. And it's a word that, as I was looking through my my tasting notes the other day, and the amount of times that I put transparent or great transparency here, and all we really mean by that is we can really feel where this is from. If you're on a heavy kind of clay soil on in Courtal, you want to feel that. You want to feel that kind of density there. Yeah, and similarly, if you're on some of the kind of great limestone-driven sites of Gevrey-Chambertin, you want to feel that too. And I think, these big, powerful vintages that you can get, which are sort of incredibly seductive, like 18, 2020 in places on the reds, 2022, they're wonderful in their own way. But I think when you're tasting them young, a vintage like 2023, 2017 in places, 2021, they give such a wonderful window onto what these wines are all about. And I loved it. I think the tasting experience when we were out there was just fabulous. And the growers are excited. I think that's what I loved as well. There's a lot of excited winemakers out there.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned whole bunch fermentation, Joe, and I'll very briefly deal with that. It's a subject that every time we bring it up with growers, our managing director, Adam Brett-Smith, rolls his eyes and sort of, I think he's thoroughly bored of the whole topic. But it is something which increasingly has become a factor in terms of the way people choose to manage their harvests. And this non-destemming, as really personified by Domenico Remini-Conti, who were the great advocates for it, whereas Henri Jaillet was the great advocate for destemming. You've got these two different schools. And I think in recent years, we've almost, what I refer to in my vintage report, as reached peak whole bunch, I think. I think it's been done almost to a level where it begins to obscure the fruit in some places, and it begins to obscure the terroir definition. Now, that's the minority of people who are doing 100% formulaically, and I think most people these days wouldn't do that. But the fact that you need to look at vintage conditions, you need to look at the ripeness of the stems, and based on that, decide what percentage of whole bunch fermentation you're going to use. I think most people are now at a level where they probably won't use more than about 50% whole bunch, depending on the year. And I think that's good. We tasted very few wines where it gives this sort of sappy, incense-laden, kind of very exotic character to the wines, which can be absolutely beautiful, but it can also be a slightly homogenizing effect on the character. And so I think, to have terroir alongside this delicacy of whole bunch expression is where you really want to be. And I think that's probably where we will end up in years to come.
Thanks, Guy. I think it's probably worth touching on before we finish the market. And, I think we probably will maybe actually do a separate podcast on the market itself, because that could be a half an hour long conversation. I ended up having what was intended to be a 5-minute conversation with a customer on Monday afternoon, and it sort of went into a sort of 30-minute backwards and forwards, just sort of dissecting the market and where it's at in quite boring levels of detail. But I think, look, where we're at 2023, I think the majority we're going to go out, and guys, chip in if you think differently. We're hoping sort of my people are probably going to stay the same as prices, and I say hopefully because 2024 is at the back of their mind, and we're not going to go into too much on 24 because obviously this is a focus on 23. But as you would have read and heard, 24 is a very small crop, especially Côte de Nuit, but across the board, a lot of disease pressures really and sorting responsible for that. And so I think at the back of that mind, it just meant that they may be sort of thinking about it when they've come to, or when they will be coming to price it. We already have confirmation that there are some producers that are coming down in price, which is great, because overall, look, it's not as good as 22 as a generalization. There are 100% some wines better in 23 than their 22 counterparts from certain domains. That's the beauty of Burgundy, and it happens every year. But as a whole, it's probably not as celebrated as we've sort of highlighted already. And so there are some producers that have come down. I think the most will stay the same. And inevitably, there's probably going to be some producers that go up. And there's been lots of sort of wheels in motion behind that thinking. And one of them will always be negociant versus domain and the part that plays. But like I said, we'll do a separate podcast on that because it is quite an interesting topic. I think demand personally will still be is high. The love for Burgundy is still at an all-time high. Obviously, we spoke to producers, and Guy, maybe you might want to touch on that. We wrote them a letter for the very first time to sort of highlight the sensitivity of the world we're in at the moment, where costs have risen all around us. And I'm not talking wine, I'm talking generally. And it just feels a little bit tougher. And maybe they should be aware of that. And versus, some producers have wines in the market with equivalent quality cases that might be able to be picked up a little bit less.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So the idea behind this letter that we wrote to Burgundy producers was simply to communicate the way that customers in the markets where we operate think. And what people do increasingly is they will check what a mature vintage of an equivalent wine is in the market. And if they feel that the current release price is too high on that basis, bearing in mind that they're going to have to pay storage charges every year between release or between UK arrival and when they finally get it out to drink it. If they feel that price with everything factored in is too high, then they'll be disinclined to buy the new vintage. And I mean, it's a very simple calculation that people do. It's not that they spend hours analyzing things on spreadsheets. I mean, some maybe do, but the majority will just sort of do a very quick check. And I think that's something which we felt it was important to communicate to producers, because this is something removed from people buying wines to invest in. It's not to do with that. It's simply people wanting to feel smart about purchasing wine at the right moment in time, at the right price. And from a producer's perspective, this release mechanism is the best possible chance they have to get their wines out into the world, into the hands of people who will love them. And it's almost a one chance shot that they have at getting the wines to the lovers of the wines at this moment in time. And that was what we wanted to communicate. I think there is well, I know there is an awareness among Burgundian producers that this is the way things work, and the fact that release prices have become quite toppy in recent years, and they know that things need to be kept at a level which is palatable to the end consumer. There is a general reticence. I think it's also fair to say going down in price when it might be seen as a sign of weakness or a sign of an inferior vintage. I think those who have been brave enough to reduce their prices in 23 should really be applauded for that. And it's not done from a position of weakness. It's really the total opposite. It's done from a position of strength, because they want to get these wines into the hands of people who will drink them. And, people will only do that if they feel that the price is right.
Yeah, the great thing about the producers that we saw was every single one of them wanted to engage with that letter and discuss those market pressures and understand how they can best make sure that people who love their wines and want to drink them are able to buy them. So there are so many external pressures at the moment on growers, on buyers of wines, and on merchants as well. It's great that it is a conversation that people were engaging with, rather than just saying, not my problem.
Anything you want to add, Neville?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've covered essentially encapsulates it. I think, yeah, there has to be. So people have to feel good. This is supposed to be fun at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think that's a really key part of it. Getting on the phone to us, receiving our emails, hopefully has to be something enjoyable. And I think if the on-premier prices are there and things are looking favourable, I think people are going to be really enthused about not only following the producers that they've historically loved, but also trying new stuff and really kind of getting under the skin of the region.
Cool. Okay, well, I think we've gone into a fair amount of detail. We don't want to go on too long, and also we want to bring a bit of light-hearted element to it as well. So I thought the question, and I'm happy to kick off. So on your week travels, chaps, in Burgundy, is there a new place that you ate at, or is there a dish that jumped out? For me on our week, there's a new. It's called Biserot, Chic et Gourmand on Place de Madeleine, which has gone under a sort of a refurb quite significantly, and quite a nice, jolly interior, actually. I really enjoyed it. Brilliant service. There was a waitress there who was quality. She was really on the game. We had to have a relatively quick turnaround, and I went for the special of the day, which was foie gras ravioli, and it was sensational. It was still pink inside, sloppy when you cut into it, actually, and with this amazing sauce and cheese. Just what you need to sit on your stomach halfway through the day, but it was unbelievably good and very decadent. So if you're heading to Beaune anytime soon, definitely check out this.
I remember you ordered more than the recommended amount and then polished it up in about 5 minutes.
Yeah. How many pieces should I have? 4. I'll have 8. Thank you. Aaron?
We went to a place called Le Garum, which Google garum if you want a really boring ancient history fact about a sauce. But the first part of it was very good, because now it seems in every sort of Burgundy bistro that they're all serving karage, which is it's fried chicken, which is stunning. I love fried chicken, so a great start there. And then we unwittingly ordered beef for the table, and I, after a long day of sort of eating and drinking quite well, tasting, I asked whether there would be vegetables, and they said yes, of course. It's served with seasonal vegetables, which were fries.
Lovely.
And quite delicious.
I think our Japanese customers would be wincing at your pronunciation of karage, but we'll take it.
I'm sorry, I didn't live in Japan.
Guy, any new hotspot?
Well, yeah, there were some things. I thought if Aaron forgives me, I might tell the spider story. I mean, is that allowed?
Yeah, that's okay.
You can always cut it retrospectively.
There's no camera of this, so
okay. But there are so many restaurants which you guys can wax lyrical about. But the funny event which happened to us on the second day of tasting. We took turns to drive the car, and on Aaron's first morning of driving, he was sort of just getting used to placement of the wing mirrors and making sure that his seat was in the right position. We were just about to join a motorway, so not stressful at all. And a very large spider crawled out from, I don't know where really, but dangled right in front of Aaron's face. And I was sitting in the back and just heard some quite panicked expletives coming from the front of the car, and wondered what on earth was happening. And
Sort of cool squeals, isn't it?
Yeah, if you've ever watched the film Deliver in the Sky, squealed like a piggy. Yeah, quite scary. And then it was don't let anybody tell you that it wasn't a huge tarantula. But by the end of the day, obviously, Guy was already warning me that he was going to tell everyone that it was a money spider, which was good.
Catastrophe averted, mate. So,
yeah, well, you didn't crap.
And Neville, what about you? Was there any?
We ate and drank very well in Burgundy. It was pretty exceptional from start to finish, to be fair. But I think we had a pretty wonderful Rue de Vaux veal sweetbreads in Bistro de Square, which was pretty lovely. So
Classic.
yeah. I mean, it just doesn't really get better than that. The land scallop, as I
like to coin it.
I like to coin it. Yeah.
Very good. Tasty gland. So anyway, look, the very final one, and I'm just going to quickly go around, and if you were to say 2 tastings from your week, and I don't want any more detail, just the names, because we're going to do a podcast on most of our agencies, that stood out for you for the most, what would they be? I'll start. For me, Le Fleuve, I was very fortunate to be a part of that tasting, which is out now, and Dugat P. Neville?
I adored Dimon Pierre. I think that's just always exceptional, but particularly exceptional in 23. And I thought Puy de l'Ours, our new one of our newer agencies, are producing some really quite beautiful wines.
Nice.
Well, gosh, I mean, spoilt for choice. I mean, I would be it would be remiss of me not to mention Domaine de la Romaine Conti, which was rather a good tasting and is one of the absolute highlights of the year and a total privilege to go to. So that was not bad. And Comme Georges de Vogüé, under the new stewardship of Jean-Louis Patelli, which I think is very good, and the wines are electric at 23. So
cool.
So both very good.
Mr. Eccles?
Francois Carillon, I think, was one of the tastings where we were palpably all quite excited about a single vineyard Puligny that was stunning. In terms of reds, I think, Rossignol Trappin was so good. It was really good. They're such good wines.
Love it. Cool. Gents, well, thank you very much. And no doubt you'll be back on the radio waves again at some point with the Burgundy Unpicked. Thanks very much for listening, and speak again soon.
Cheers.
Thanks.